There is a kind of tiredness that does not come from doing too much, but from holding too much, from being emotionally available for everyone else while slowly losing contact with yourself. If you are listening to this, you may be someone who functions well on the outside. You meet responsibilities. You show up. You think clearly. You care deeply. And yet, beneath that competence, there is a quiet strain, an ongoing effort to manage emotions, maintain harmony, and stay composed, even when something inside you feels overextended. This audiobook is not here to tell you to be stronger, more assertive, or more disciplined. You have already tried effort. You have already tried understanding. What you may not have been given is an explanation that actually matches your lived experience. Many people struggle with emotional boundaries not because they lack insight or courage, but because their nervous system learned long ago that staying open and accommodating was the safest way to remain connected. Over time, that adaptation becomes invisible. It feels like personality, like goodness, like responsibility, and slowly it becomes exhausting. This book is an invitation to understand what is happening beneath that exhaustion. We will not rush. We will not prescribe scripts or force change. Instead, we will explore how emotional boundaries form, why they collapse under pressure, and how regulation, not willpower, is the foundation of inner freedom. We will look at the difference between caring and carrying, between empathy and self-erasure, between effort and containment. Most importantly, this is not a journey toward becoming someone new. It is a gradual return to a self that no longer has to override its own signals in order to feel safe, connected, or good. If you have ever felt guilty for needing space, tired of explaining yourself, or confused by why insight alone has not brought relief, you are not broken. You are responding exactly as a sensitive, intelligent nervous system learned to respond. This audiobook is designed to meet you there, with clarity, patience, and respect. Welcome to Book Fuel English, and welcome back to yourself. Section 1. The Quiet Exhaustion Beneath Being Fine. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that rarely announces itself as distress. It does not always feel like sadness, panic, or collapse. More often, it feels like being constantly on, alert, available, responsible, capable. It is the exhaustion of people who function well, who show up, who keep their lives moving forward, and who are often told by others and by themselves that they are doing just fine. And yet, beneath that surface competence, something feels strained, tight, or quietly depleted. This exhaustion is not dramatic. It does not beg for attention. It accumulates slowly, almost invisibly, through years of emotional self-management, through the subtle habit of monitoring yourself in relation to others, through anticipating reactions, adjusting tone, softening truths, absorbing moods, and carrying emotional weight that was never clearly yours to hold. Over time, this becomes so familiar that it no longer registers as effort. It simply feels like life. Many people listening to this are not confused about what they feel. They are tired of explanations that frame their experience as a lack of gratitude, resilience, or positivity. They have already reflected deeply. They understand patterns. They have tried to improve themselves. And yet, despite insight and intelligence, the internal pressure remains, not sharp enough to force a breakdown, but persistent enough to erode ease. What is often missed is that this state is not the result of being too sensitive or insufficiently strong. It is the predictable outcome of living without clear emotional boundaries. Not boundaries as rules or confrontations, but boundaries as an internal structure that differentiates where you end and where others begin. When that structure is unclear or underdeveloped, emotional energy leaks outward. Attention is pulled away from internal signals. Responsibility spreads beyond what the nervous system can sustainably hold. This kind of exhaustion does not come from doing too much. It comes from being too permeable, from remaining open in environments where some degree of containment was needed, from responding to emotional cues that were never formally requested, from assuming responsibility for outcomes, feelings, and relational balance that were never truly yours to manage. Over time, this creates a subtle internal posture of vigilance, a scanning for what is needed, a readiness to adjust, a background tension that says, stay available, stay acceptable, stay ahead of disruption. Even in moments of rest, this posture rarely fully releases. The body may pause, but the system does not truly settle. Because this pattern develops gradually, it often goes unrecognized. It becomes part of identity, being reliable, being understanding, being emotionally attuned. These qualities are not problems in themselves. They only become costly when they operate without limits, without choice, and without recovery. When responsiveness becomes reflex rather than decision, exhaustion follows naturally. This is why many people feel confused by their own fatigue. They cannot point to a single crisis or trauma that explains it. Their lives may appear stable, their relationships functional, their careers intact, and yet something feels heavy, not unbearable, but unrelenting, a sense of being slightly overextended at all times. This exhaustion is often accompanied by a quiet self-questioning, a wondering why ease feels so elusive, why rest does not restore, why even positive interactions can feel draining. The mind searches for solutions, often turning inward with critique. Maybe I should be more disciplined, more assertive, more detached, more generous. The effort increases, but the relief does not. What is happening instead is that the system has been operating without sufficient differentiation. Emotional signals from others are processed as demands. Discomfort is interpreted as something to fix. Relational tension is experienced as a personal responsibility. Over time, this blurs internal reference points. You may know what you think, but feel less certain about what you feel or need in the moment. Importantly, none of this indicates pathology, it indicates adaptation. Many people learned early on that emotional attunement was necessary for safety, connection, or stability. They became skilled at reading rooms, adjusting themselves, and minimizing friction. These skills worked. They protected relationships. They preserved belonging. They reduced overt conflict. And because they worked, they stayed. But what once functioned as a survival strategy can quietly become a source of chronic strain. The system does not forget the conditions under which it learned. It continues to operate as if connection depends on constant emotional availability, as if withdrawal equals risk, as if saying no, even internally, threatens something essential. This creates an internal environment where self-abandonment is not dramatic, but habitual. Small moments of overriding signals, ignoring fatigue, dismissing irritation, rationalizing discomfort. None of these feel significant alone. Together, they form a pattern of chronic overextension that the nervous system experiences as ongoing demand. The exhaustion that results is not a failure of coping. It is a message, not a demand for drastic change, but an indication that the current way of relating to others and to yourself is not sustainable. And importantly, it is not asking for force, it is asking for understanding. Before anything can shift, there must be relief from self-blame, from the idea that you should have figured this out already, from the assumption that exhaustion means you are doing something wrong. In reality, you have been doing something very consistently. You have been maintaining connection, stability, and functionality by extending yourself beyond your natural limits. This audiobook does not begin with correction, because correction would only add more effort to an already over-efforted system. It begins with recognition, with naming what has been happening quietly and over time, with acknowledging that feeling fine on the surface can coexist with deep internal fatigue. As this understanding settles, something subtle may happen, a slight softening, not because anything has been fixed, but because the struggle has been accurately named. And from this place of clarity, rather than urgency, it becomes possible to look more closely at how these patterns formed and why they have been so difficult to change. Section 2. Why you learn to override yourself. There is a common assumption that if a pattern causes exhaustion, it must have been chosen poorly, that if something drains you, it must be incorrect, irrational, or self-sabotaging. But psychological patterns rarely form around what feels good. They form around what works. And for many people, learning to override themselves was not a mistake. It was an adaptation to the emotional environment they were in. Early in life, the nervous system learns through experience what preserves connection and what threatens it. This learning does not happen through logic or language. It happens through repeated emotional outcomes. When certain expressions lead to closeness, safety, or approval, the system marks them as viable. When other expressions lead to distance, tension, or unpredictability, the system learns to inhibit them. Over time, this becomes automatic. For some, emotional expression was welcomed only when it was manageable, positive, or convenient. For others, needs were met inconsistently, requiring vigilance and sensitivity to subtle cues. Some learned that taking up too much space created conflict. Others learned that emotional restraint kept things stable. In each case, the system adapted not to truth, but to consequence. This is where emotional boundaries quietly begin to blur. When connection depends on attunement rather than authenticity, the system learns to prioritize external signals over internal ones. It becomes safer to read the room than to feel the body, safer to anticipate than to assert, safer to adjust than to disrupt. None of this requires conscious choice. It emerges naturally when belonging feels conditional. Importantly, this adaptation often occurs in people who are perceptive, intelligent, and emotionally sensitive. The very capacities that later contribute to exhaustion are the ones that made early adaptation possible. Sensitivity allowed for nuance. Intelligence allowed for pattern recognition. Emotional range allowed for flexibility. These traits were not liabilities, they were resources. But adaptation always involves trade-offs. When the system learns that self-expression risks connection, it does not eliminate need. It redirects it. Signals that once moved outward begin to move inward. Discomfort becomes internalized. Limits become negotiable. Fatigue becomes normalized. Over time, overriding oneself feels less like suppression and more like maturity. Social conditioning often reinforces this pattern. Many environments reward composure, cooperation, and emotional regulation without teaching internal containment. Being easy, understanding, or low maintenance is often praised. Emotional labor is subtly expected, especially from those who appear capable. The system learns again that responsiveness equals value. What makes this particularly difficult to recognize is that the results are often positive in the short term. Relationships remain intact. Conflict is minimized. Others feel supported. Stability is preserved. From the outside, the adaptation looks successful. From the inside, the cost accumulates quietly. Over time, internal signals begin to lose authority. Fatigue is rationalized, irritation is softened, desire is postponed. The body speaks, but the system has learned not to listen too closely. This does not feel like betrayal. It feels like responsibility, like being an adult, like being reasonable. Many people then carry this pattern into adulthood without reevaluating its necessity. The system continues to operate as if connection remains fragile, as if stability requires constant monitoring, as if withdrawal equals danger. Even when circumstances change, the nervous system does not automatically update. It operates on learned probabilities, not present facts. This is why insight alone rarely resolves boundary confusion. You may intellectually understand that you are allowed to say no, rest, or disappoint others, but the body responds as if those actions still carry risk. The nervous system remembers outcomes, not explanations. It remembers what once threatened connection, and it moves to prevent it. Seen through this lens, overriding yourself was not self-neglect. It was self-protection. It reduced uncertainty. It maintained attachment. It preserved order. And because it worked, it became embedded. The system does not easily relinquish strategies that once ensured safety. There is also an identity layer to this adaptation. Many people come to know themselves as the one who manages, stabilizes, or understands. This role can feel grounding. It offers coherence and purpose. Letting go of it can feel disorienting, even threatening. Without it, who are you in relation to others? This is where self-judgment often enters. From the present, the pattern looks unnecessary. The mind asks why you still tolerate, still overextend, still hesitate. But this judgment overlooks the intelligence of the original adaptation. It assumes the system should have updated automatically without acknowledging how deeply these patterns are wired. Boundary confusion persists not because you are unaware, but because the nervous system is still operating on an old map. A map drawn when connection required vigilance, when expression required modulation, when safety depended on flexibility rather than solidity. Understanding this does not immediately change behavior, but it does something equally important. It removes blame. It replaces the question, "What is wrong with me?" with "What did this help me survive?" That shift alone can reduce internal tension. As this perspective settles, patterns begin to look less like flaws and more like residues of earlier contexts. You may notice how quickly you orient toward others, how reflexively you accommodate, how easily your attention leaves your own experience. These are not random habits. They are learned movements. And learned movements can be renegotiated, but only when the system feels safe enough to do so. Before boundaries can be clarified, the conditions that once required their absence must be understood, not intellectually, but somatically. The body needs to know that the environment has changed. This is why the next step is not assertion or correction, but understanding how the nervous system maintains these patterns and what it needs in order to release them. Section 3, the failure of willpower and better communication. At some point, many people arrive at the same conclusion. If the problem is boundaries, then the solution must be clarity, confidence, and better communication. They read about assertiveness. They rehearse conversations in their mind. They practice saying no in theory. They promise themselves that next time will be different. And for a brief moment, this feels reasonable. After all, boundaries sound like decisions. Decisions sound like choices, and choices sound like willpower. But this is usually where frustration quietly deepens. You may have noticed that knowing what you want to say does not reliably translate into saying it. That understanding your patterns does not prevent you from repeating them. That even after insight, practice, and preparation, you still find yourself agreeing, accommodating, or explaining long past your internal limit. And afterward, there is often a familiar mix of disappointment and self-criticism. Why did I freeze again? Why didn't I speak up? Why do I understand this so well, yet fail to act on it? What is rarely acknowledged is that most boundary advice is built on an incomplete model of human behavior. It assumes that behavior is primarily governed by conscious choice, that if you think clearly enough, prepare thoroughly enough, or try hard enough, the body will follow. But this is not how the nervous system works. Willpower operates at the level of the thinking mind. Boundaries, however, collapse or hold at the level of the body. They are not executed by logic alone, but by an internal sense of safety, capacity, and permission. When these conditions are absent, no amount of mental rehearsal can override the system's deeper priorities. This is why better communication so often fails. You may communicate clearly in low-stakes situations or when you feel calm and resourced. But when emotional tension rises, when attachment feels threatened, or when another person's reaction becomes unpredictable, the system shifts. The body moves into protection. Attention narrows. Muscles tighten or soften reflexively. The priority is no longer clarity, but stability. In these moments, the nervous system is not asking, "What do I want to say?" It is asking, "What will keep the situation from escalating?" Or, "What will preserve connection?" Or, "How do I get through this without disruption?" These questions are answered far more quickly than conscious thought can intervene. The result is a familiar experience. You feel yourself crossing a line internally, but you continue anyway. You say yes when you mean no. You soften when you want to be firm. You explain when you want to stop talking, and afterward, you may blame yourself for lacking strength or discipline, but strength was never the missing ingredient. The deeper issue is that willpower asks the system to do something it does not yet feel safe doing. It demands output without addressing capacity. It treats boundaries as acts of courage rather than expressions of regulation. And when the system cannot comply, shame often fills the gap. Shame thrives in this space. It whispers that you are weak, inconsistent, or flawed. It suggests that if you truly valued yourself, you would behave differently. Over time, repeated failures reinforce this narrative. You may begin to doubt not just your boundaries, but your reliability as an agent of your own life. Ironically, this self-judgment further undermines boundary capacity. Shame is itself a threat signal. It tightens the nervous system, increases self-monitoring, and heightens sensitivity to others' reactions. The more you criticize yourself for not holding boundaries, the more vigilant and permeable you become. This creates a cycle that is easy to miss. You notice a boundary issue. You apply effort. The effort fails under pressure. You judge yourself. The judgment increases internal stress. Under increased stress, boundaries collapse more easily, and the cycle repeats, each time with slightly less trust in yourself. Many people respond to this by doubling down on strategy. They search for better phrases, firmer scripts, more precise explanations. They try to anticipate every possible reaction so they can prepare a response. This can feel productive, even responsible, but internally it often increases cognitive load and emotional tension. Overthinking is not a sign of carelessness. It is a sign that the system does not trust spontaneity. It believes that safety depends on preparation. But boundaries that require constant rehearsal are rarely sustainable. They depend on mental energy that is already depleted. What is missing from this entire approach is an understanding of readiness. Boundaries are not simply spoken. They are supported by an internal state. When the system feels regulated, oriented, and resourced, boundaries arise with less effort. When it does not, even simple limits can feel impossible. This is why insight alone does not change behavior. Insight lives in the cortex. Boundaries are enforced or bypassed by subcortical systems designed to manage threat, attachment, and survival. These systems do not respond to logic in the moment. They respond to cues of safety and danger. You can see this clearly when you notice how context-dependent your boundaries are. You may feel capable with certain people and completely collapse with others. You may assert yourself at work, but not with family. You may speak up when calm, but go silent when emotion enters the room. This inconsistency is often interpreted as weakness. In reality, it reflects varying levels of nervous system load. The problem is not that you lack skills, it is that you are trying to apply skills without first addressing the physiological conditions required to use them. This is like asking a system under threat to perform as if it were at ease. When boundary attempts fail, many people conclude that they need to push harder, be firmer, be less caring, care less about outcomes. But pushing against the nervous system rarely produces lasting change. More often, it creates internal conflict. One part of you demands strength. Another part prioritizes safety. The tension between them becomes exhausting. Understanding this begins to reframe the entire issue. The question shifts from why can't I hold boundaries, Uwash, to what happens in my system when I try. This is a very different inquiry. It moves away from moral judgment and toward observation. You may begin to notice subtle signals that precede boundary collapse, a tightening in the chest, a quickening of thought, a softening of posture, a sense of urgency to resolve discomfort. These are not failures, they are data. They indicate that the system has entered a protective state. In this state, the goal is not expression, but regulation. The system is trying to reduce threat as quickly as possible. Often, accommodation is the fastest route. It smooths interaction, it reduces uncertainty, it restores a sense of order. From the nervous system's perspective, it is effective. This is why boundaries enforced purely through willpower feel brittle. They require constant override of protective impulses. They rely on suppression rather than integration, and they often collapse when emotional intensity rises. The disappointment that follows is understandable. You may feel betrayed by your own reactions, but these reactions are not arbitrary. They are organized around safety. Until safety is addressed, behavior will continue to follow the same patterns, regardless of intention. This does not mean boundaries are impossible. It means they cannot be built on force alone. They require a different foundation, one that does not ask the system to fight itself. As this becomes clearer, there is often a quiet sense of relief, not because a solution has been offered, but because the struggle has been correctly located. The problem is not a lack of will. It is a mismatch between expectation and physiology. From here, the work naturally shifts away from scripts and strategies, away from self-correction, toward understanding how the nervous system governs these moments and what it needs in order to allow boundaries to emerge without collapse. That deeper explanation is where we turn next. Section 4. The nervous system behind boundary collapse. To understand why boundaries fail in the moment they matter most, you have to look beneath behavior and belief, beneath personality and preference, and into the nervous system itself. Not as an abstract concept, but as a living, responsive system whose primary task is not self-expression, but survival and stability. The nervous system is always asking one central question: am I safe enough right now to stay open, or do I need to protect? This question is answered continuously, far faster than conscious thought, through sensation, pattern recognition, and prediction. Long before language enters the picture, the body has already decided how much contact, exposure, or resistance is tolerable. Emotional boundaries are not enforced by ideas. They are regulated by this system. When regulation is sufficient, boundaries feel natural, almost invisible. When regulation falters, boundaries dissolve, regardless of intention. This is why boundary collapse so often feels sudden and confusing. One moment you are clear, the next you are agreeing, explaining, or absorbing. It can feel as though something hijacked you. In a sense, something did. The autonomic nervous system governs this process. It operates outside of conscious control, organizing responses to perceived threat or safety. When it detects danger, whether physical or relational, it reallocates resources toward protection. Blood flow shifts, attention narrows, muscles prepare. The priority becomes stabilization, not authenticity. For many people, relational tension is registered as threat, not because it is inherently dangerous, but because the system learned early that disruption risked connection, predictability, or care. Raised voices, disappointment, withdrawal, or emotional intensity became cues that something was wrong. Over time, the nervous system began to respond to these cues automatically. One common response in such environments is not fight or flight, but fawn. Fawning is a survival strategy characterized by appeasement, compliance, and emotional attunement to others. It is highly relational. The system attempts to reduce threat by becoming agreeable, helpful, or accommodating. Fawning is not weakness. It is intelligence under constraint. It works by smoothing interactions, minimizing conflict, and restoring relational equilibrium. But it comes at a cost. The cost is self-reference. Internal signals are deprioritized so external signals can be managed. When the fawn response is active, boundaries feel dangerous. Saying no feels like escalation. Pausing feels like risk. Even silence can feel unsafe. The system moves quickly toward whatever behavior has historically reduced tension, often before the mind has time to intervene. This is why boundaries cannot simply be willed into place. In the presence of perceived threat, the nervous system does not consult values or plans. It consults memory. It activates what once worked. Another factor is emotional contagion. Humans are wired to resonate with the emotional states of others. This is part of social bonding. But when boundaries are weak, resonance becomes absorption. The nervous system picks up another person's distress, urgency, or expectation and treats it as its own. In these moments, the line between self and other blurs. You may feel pressure without knowing why, guilt without a clear cause, responsibility without a request. This is not imagination. It is the nervous system responding to cues as if they require action. Without sufficient internal containment, the system seeks relief by resolving the perceived demand. Accommodation becomes regulation. Agreeing reduces tension. Explaining restores balance. Overgiving quiets discomfort. These behaviors are not chosen freely. They are regulatory maneuvers. This reframes boundary collapse entirely. It is not a failure of character. It is a response to dysregulation. The system is doing what it knows how to do to return to equilibrium. Importantly, regulation is not a static trait. It fluctuates based on context, fatigue, stress, and relational dynamics. This explains why boundaries may hold one day and collapse the next, why you may feel solid in one relationship and diffuse in another. The nervous system is responding to different levels of load. When load is low, there is capacity for reflection and choice. When load is high, the system defaults to survival strategies. This is not conscious. It is protective. Many people misunderstand this and attempt to strengthen boundaries by hardening themselves, by becoming colder, more distant, or less responsive. But hardness is not regulation. Often it is another form of protection layered over fragility. True boundaries arise from containment, not tension, from a system that feels safe enough to differentiate without bracing. This safety does not come from forcing oneself to be brave. It comes from the nervous system learning that differentiation no longer equals danger. This learning cannot be rushed. It happens through repeated experiences of staying present without collapse, of noticing sensation without immediately acting, of tolerating small amounts of discomfort without overriding oneself. Each of these experiences updates the system's expectations. When the system begins to register that connection can survive disappointment, that tension can pass without catastrophe, boundaries start to feel less threatening. They stop requiring force. They begin to feel like information. This is why safety, not strength, is the missing prerequisite. Strength implies effort. Safety allows release. Boundaries enforced through effort exhaust the system. Boundaries supported by safety conserve energy. Understanding this can change how you relate to yourself in moments of collapse. Instead of asking why you failed, you may begin to ask what your system perceived, what it was protecting, what it needed. This shift alone reduces internal conflict. It aligns you with the intelligence of your own biology rather than setting you against it. From here, the work becomes less about control and more about capacity. As this understanding deepens, it naturally leads toward a new question. If boundaries depend on regulation, then what helps the nervous system regulate? What conditions allow it to settle, differentiate, and remain present without collapse. That is where we move next. Section 5. Regulation before separation. Once it becomes clear that boundaries fail not because of weakness, but because the nervous system is overwhelmed, the entire direction of change shifts. The focus moves away from separation as an action and toward regulation as a condition. Not what you say, not what you explain, not how firmly you assert, but what state your system is in before anything is said at all. This is a subtle but profound reorientation. It asks you to stop treating boundaries as events and start understanding them as byproducts. When the system is regulated, boundaries tend to emerge naturally. When it is not, even the most carefully planned limits collapse under pressure. Regulation does not mean calm in the superficial sense. It does not require relaxation, positivity, or emotional neutrality. Regulation means the nervous system has enough capacity to stay present with sensation, emotion, and impulse without needing to immediately resolve them. It is the difference between being with an experience and being overtaken by it. For many people, this is unfamiliar territory. They have learned to respond quickly to internal discomfort, to fix, explain, accommodate, or withdraw before sensation fully registers. This responsiveness once served an important function. It reduced uncertainty, it shortened exposure to tension, it restored equilibrium. But it also trained the system to associate internal sensation with urgency. Regulation begins by interrupting that urgency, not through force, but through allowance. It starts with the smallest possible shift, staying a few seconds longer with what is already there, not to analyze it, not to change it, simply to notice it without immediate action. This is where the body becomes central. Boundaries are not first felt as thoughts. They are felt as sensations. A tightening, a heaviness, a pull forward or a pull back. A subtle signal that something is too much, too fast, or not aligned. When these signals are habitually overridden, the system loses trust that they matter. Regulation restores that trust. Early attempts at this often feel uncomfortable, not because anything is wrong, but because the system is not used to staying. Sensation that was previously discharged through action now lingers. There may be restlessness, heat, pressure, or a vague sense of unease. This is not a sign to stop. It is a sign that regulation is beginning. The key is orientation rather than endurance. You are not asked to tolerate discomfort indefinitely. You are asked to notice that you can stay with it briefly without catastrophe, that the sensation rises and falls on its own, that nothing needs to be decided in that moment. Attention plays a crucial role here. Where attention goes, the nervous system follows. When attention is pulled outward toward others, regulation weakens. When attention is anchored internally, regulation strengthens. This does not mean withdrawing from the world. It means maintaining an internal reference point while remaining in contact. You might notice, for example, that in conversations where boundaries later collapse, attention leaves your body early. It moves into monitoring, predicting, adjusting. Regulation begins by gently bringing attention back, not in a dramatic way, but as a quiet check-in. What is happening in my chest right now? In my breath? In my posture? These questions are not meant to produce answers. They are meant to restore contact. Contact with sensation grounds the system in the present moment where choice becomes possible again. It is important to emphasize that this is not a technique to control outcomes. Regulation is not a means to an end. It is an environment in which different responses can emerge. When treated as a fix, it becomes another form of effort. When treated as exploration, it supports learning. This is why it helps to think of these practices as experiments rather than solutions. You are not trying to become someone who never overextends. You are learning how your system behaves when you pause, when you stay, when you do less. Curiosity replaces self-correction. One of the most counterintuitive aspects of this work is that boundaries often appear first internally, not externally. You may notice moments where you still say yes, but something inside does not collapse, or where you feel a clear no internally, even if you do not express it yet. These are not failures. They are signs that regulation is increasing. Internal boundaries matter. They reduce self-abandonment even when external change is slow. They allow the system to register its own limits without immediately overriding them. Over time, this internal clarity creates pressure for external alignment, but without force. Another important aspect of regulation is pacing. Many people attempt to change boundaries at the most emotionally charged moments, with family, authority figures, or high-stakes relationships. But the nervous system learns best under manageable load. Regulation grows through repetition in low-risk contexts. This might look like noticing when you are tired and allowing yourself to stop engaging internally, even if you remain present externally, or recognizing a subtle irritation and letting it exist without softening it away. These moments retrain the system to tolerate differentiation without threat. Breath can support this process, not as a tool to calm down, but as a way to stay connected. A slightly slower exhale, a pause at the bottom of the breath. These signals tell the nervous system that there is no immediate emergency. They create space. Importantly, regulation does not mean suppressing impulse. It means delaying response long enough for impulse to be felt fully. This delay is where choice lives. Without it, behavior is reflexive. With it, boundaries can form organically. As regulation increases, something subtle begins to change. The urge to explain softens. The compulsion to fix diminishes, not because you are trying to stop caring, but because the system no longer needs to resolve tension immediately to feel safe. This is often accompanied by a sense of internal solidity, not rigidity, but weight, presence, a feeling of being here rather than leaning forward. From this state, boundaries feel less like actions and more like natural consequences. You stop because you are done. You pause because you need to. You decline because it does not fit. None of this requires confrontation. In fact, confrontation often becomes unnecessary. When the system is regulated, clarity communicates itself through tone, timing, and energy. Others may sense it before words are spoken. This does not mean that all relationships will adjust smoothly. Regulation does not guarantee ease, but it changes the internal experience of difficulty. You may still feel discomfort, but you are less likely to disappear inside it. What matters most is that regulation restores continuity with yourself. It allows you to remain present even when there is tension, uncertainty, or potential disappointment. From this place, boundaries are no longer acts of defiance. They are expressions of coherence. As internal stabilization becomes more familiar, another layer begins to surface. The beliefs and fears that made boundaries feel morally dangerous. The idea that discomfort equals harm. that disappointment equals injury, that emotional responsibility is unlimited. These assumptions begin to loosen only when the system can stay regulated long enough to examine them. And that is where we turn next. Section 6, Emotional Responsibility and the Myth of Harm. Even when regulation increases and internal signals become clearer, many people find themselves stopping just short of external boundaries. Not because they do not know what they feel, but because something deeper intervenes. A fear that is less about safety and more about morality. A sense that saying no, pulling back, or not responding might cause harm. This fear is often quiet but powerful. It does not announce itself as belief. It feels more like an obligation, a pressure that says, if I don't manage this, something bad will happen. Over time, this pressure becomes fused with identity. Being good means being available. Being caring means being responsive. Being safe means not disappointing. This is where emotional responsibility becomes confused. Emotional responsibility, in its healthy form, means being accountable for your own actions, intentions, and impact. It does not mean managing other people's internal states, but for many, this distinction was never clearly taught or modeled. Instead, responsibility slowly expanded to include preventing discomfort, smoothing reactions, and absorbing emotional fallout. This expansion often begins early, when a child notices that certain emotions upset caregivers. They learn to regulate not only themselves, but the environment. They learn that harmony depends on anticipation, that stability depends on suppression, that someone has to hold the emotional center, and it might as well be them. Over time, this role solidifies. The system learns that other people's distress is not neutral information, but a problem to be solved. Guilt becomes the mechanism that enforces this role. Not loud guilt, but a subtle sense of wrongness that arises when you consider not intervening. This is why boundaries often feel cruel rather than neutral. The nervous system does not experience them as limits, but as withdrawals, as abandonment, as harm. But this experience is built on a critical misunderstanding, the confusion between discomfort and damage. Discomfort is an inherent part of human interaction. It arises whenever expectations are unmet, desires are frustrated, or differences are revealed. It is not inherently dangerous. Damage, on the other hand, involves injury to safety, dignity, or autonomy. These are not the same thing. When emotional responsibility is misplaced, the system treats discomfort as damage. It assumes that if someone feels disappointed, hurt, or upset, something has gone wrong. And if something has gone wrong, someone must be at fault. Often that fault is assigned internally. This creates an impossible standard. It requires you to prevent all negative emotional responses in others, regardless of cost to yourself. And because this is not possible, guilt becomes chronic. Guilt in this context does not mean you have done something wrong. It means you have violated an internal rule that was designed to preserve connection. That rule may no longer be accurate, but it remains active. This is why boundaries feel morally charged. They are not just behavioral shifts. They threaten a core belief that your role is to maintain emotional equilibrium for others. Stepping out of that role can feel like a betrayal, even when nothing overtly harmful is happening. Empathy is often implicated here. Many people fear that boundaries will make them less empathetic, less kind, less human. But empathy does not require fusion. In fact, fusion undermines empathy by eliminating differentiation. Empathy is the capacity to understand and resonate with another's experience while remaining grounded in your own. Fusion is the loss of that grounding. When you fuse, you do not empathize with pain. You absorb it. And once absorbed, it must be discharged somehow, often through accommodation. This is not sustainable care. It is self-erasure disguised as compassion. True care includes limits. It recognizes that each person is responsible for their own emotional processing. You can witness discomfort without resolving it. You can remain present without intervening. You can care without caring. But this distinction is difficult to embody when guilt has been conditioned as a signal of danger. Guilt feels like an alarm. It urges immediate correction. It does not ask whether the alarm is accurate. Many people assume guilt is a moral compass, but guilt is often a conditioned response to boundary formation. It signals deviation from an internalized role, not necessarily from ethical behavior. When you begin to hold boundaries, guilt often increases temporarily. This is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is evidence that the system is encountering unfamiliar territory. The old rules are being challenged and the alarm is sounding. If guilt is interpreted as proof of harm, boundaries will remain locked in place. The work here is not to eliminate guilt, but to recontextualize it, to see it as a residue of earlier conditioning rather than a verdict. This requires a careful reframing of responsibility. You are responsible for how you act, not for how others feel. You are responsible for being honest, not for being comfortable to everyone. You are responsible for your side of the interaction, not for managing its emotional outcome. This does not mean indifference. It means appropriate ownership. When responsibility is correctly allocated, something shifts internally. The pressure to preemptively soothe decreases. The urge to explain excessively softens. You may still care deeply, but the care no longer requires self-neglect. This also clarifies why boundaries can feel destabilizing in relationships built on emotional overfunctioning. When you stop caring what was never yours, others may feel the absence, not because you are harming them, but because the system has changed. Discomfort emerges where overaccommodation once smoothed everything over. This discomfort is not damage, it is adjustment. Many people fear that if they allow this adjustment, relationships will collapse. Sometimes relationships do change, but what is revealed is not cruelty, it is structure. Relationships that require self-erasure to function are already unstable. Boundaries do not create fragility, they expose it. Another layer of the myth of harm is the belief that others cannot tolerate their own emotions. This belief often originates in early environments where emotional regulation was externalized. Someone had to manage the emotional climate. Over time, the system learned that others would fall apart without intervention. As an adult, this belief often persists unexamined. You may assume that if you do not respond, explain, or fix, someone will be overwhelmed. But this assumption denies others their own regulatory capacity. It treats them as fragile, even when they are not. Allowing others to feel their feelings without rescuing them is not abandonment. It is respect. It acknowledges their autonomy. It gives them space to process, adapt, and respond. This is often uncomfortable at first, especially for those whose sense of worth has been tied to emotional usefulness. Stepping back can feel like becoming irrelevant, or cold, or unsafe. But over time, something different emerges. Interactions become clearer. less burdened, less performative. Care becomes choice rather than obligation. This does not happen all at once. Old moral narratives loosen gradually. You may notice moments where guilt arises, but you do not immediately act on it, where you allow someone else's discomfort to exist without rushing to relieve it. These moments are not failures of kindness. They are acts of differentiation. Differentiation is not separation. It is the ability to remain connected without collapsing into the other. It is the foundation of healthy boundaries. As differentiation increases, the fear of harm slowly recalibrates. The system begins to learn that discomfort can pass. That connection can survive disappointment. That care does not require constant self-sacrifice. This learning is experiential, not conceptual. It happens through repeated moments of staying present without intervening, of allowing the emotional field to be imperfect, of trusting that not every tension needs immediate resolution. As these experiences accumulate, the internal moral pressure begins to soften. Boundaries no longer feel like violations. They feel like honesty. From here, the work becomes more practical and contextual. How these shifts play out in real relationships, real conversations, and real moments of ambiguity. That is where we turn next. Section 7. Boundaries in real life, when it's messy and unclear. Up to this point, much of what we have explored may have felt clarifying, even relieving. Patterns have been named, mechanisms explained, internal experiences validated. And yet, when these insights meet real life, things often become less tidy, not more. Boundaries, when lived rather than conceptualized, rarely unfold in clean lines. They appear in fragments, hesitations, partial shifts, and moments that do not quite resolve. This is not a failure of the work. It is the nature of applying internal change within complex relational systems. Real life does not offer neutral conditions. Family histories carry emotional momentum. Intimate relationships involve attachment and vulnerability. Work dynamics include power, evaluation, and dependency. In these contexts, boundaries are not isolated actions. They are negotiations between internal regulation and external reality. One of the most destabilizing aspects of this stage is unevenness. You may notice that you can hold boundaries in one area of life and not another, that you feel clear one day and confused the next, that a single interaction can undo what felt stable the week before. This inconsistency is often interpreted as regression. In reality, it reflects variability in nervous system load and relational complexity. Boundaries do not evolve uniformly because your system is not uniform across contexts. Each relationship activates different histories, expectations, and emotional stakes. The work is not to become consistent everywhere, but to remain oriented internally even when capacity fluctuates. This is where internal reference points become more important than external performance. Instead of asking, "Did I say the right thing?" the question shifts to, "Was I present with myself while this happened?" Presence is a more reliable measure of progress than outcome. In many real-life situations, especially with family or long-standing relationships, boundaries will feel incomplete. You may sense a limit internally but not express it fully. You may express it and then soften it. You may express it and later feel unsure. These moments are not mistakes. They are transitional states. Transitional states are uncomfortable because they lack resolution. The system prefers closure. But boundaries often develop through prolonged ambiguity. You are no longer fully self-erasing, but not yet fully defined. This in-between space can feel unstable, even shame-inducing. Shame often reappears here, not because something has gone wrong, but because the old identity is loosening. When you no longer perform the familiar role perfectly, you may feel exposed. Others may notice the change before you feel settled in it. Their confusion or pushback can intensify self-doubt. This is where pacing becomes essential. Not pacing as avoidance, but pacing as respect for capacity. Boundaries that emerge too quickly, without sufficient regulation, often trigger backlash internally or externally. Boundaries that emerge slowly allow the system to adapt. In practical terms, this may mean allowing yourself to pause rather than decide, to say less rather than more, to leave something unresolved. These are not weak moves. They are regulatory strategies. Rupture is another inevitable part of real-life boundary work. When patterns shift, misunderstandings occur. Others may feel surprised, hurt, or defensive. You may feel guilt, regret, or fear. The presence of rupture does not indicate failure. It indicates change. What matters is not avoiding rupture, but how repair is approached. Repair does not mean undoing the boundary. It means restoring connection without abandoning yourself. This may involve acknowledging impact without retracting your limit, or clarifying intention without over-explaining. Repair is subtle. It does not require perfect language. It requires internal alignment. When you remain regulated while acknowledging tension, the system learns that conflict is survivable. Progress at this stage is often quiet. There may be fewer dramatic moments of assertion and more subtle shifts in posture, tone, and timing. You may notice that you disengage sooner, that you feel irritation without immediately smoothing it, that you recover more quickly after overextending. These changes can feel underwhelming if you are expecting transformation to be visible, but internally they represent significant reorganization. The system is learning that it can remain intact without constant accommodation. Failure in this context takes on a different meaning. You may still override yourself. You may still say yes when you meant no. But the difference is that you notice it sooner. And when you notice it, you do not immediately turn against yourself. This reduction in self-attack is not incidental. It is foundational. When shame decreases, regulation increases. When regulation increases, boundaries strengthen organically. In work environments, this may look like tolerating dissatisfaction without immediate correction, letting tasks remain incomplete, allowing others to be disappointed. These moments can feel risky, especially when identity is tied to competence, but they are opportunities for differentiation. In intimate relationships, boundaries may surface as changes in availability. Less emotional processing, more silence, more space. This can feel threatening on both sides. The urge to explain is often strong. Sometimes explanation helps. Sometimes it reinforces the idea that boundaries require justification. Learning when not to explain is part of this stage, not as withdrawal, but as trust. Trust that your internal signals are sufficient. Trust that not everything needs to be made comfortable immediately. Family dynamics often bring the most complexity. Long-standing roles resist change. When one person shifts, the system reacts. This reaction can feel personal. It often is not. It is the system attempting to restore equilibrium. Staying regulated in the face of this pull is challenging. You may feel old impulses return strongly. This does not mean the work has failed. It means you are in contact with deeply encoded patterns. At this stage, tolerating ambiguity becomes a core skill. You may not know how a relationship will reorganize. You may not know whether a boundary will hold. You may not know what the right version of yourself looks like yet. This uncertainty is not a problem to solve. It is a condition to inhabit. Boundaries mature through lived experience, not certainty. Each time you stay present without collapsing or attacking yourself, the system updates. Each time you allow an interaction to be imperfect without fixing it, capacity increases. What often surprises people here is how little force is required once internal alignment grows. You may find that some boundaries no longer need to be stated. They are felt. Others respond differently without explicit conversation. This is not manipulation. It is coherence. This stage can feel anticlimactic. There is no moment where everything clicks into place. Instead, there is a gradual sense of solidity, less urgency, less internal noise, more tolerance for complexity. And within that complexity, a new orientation begins to form, one that is less about managing interaction and more about inhabiting yourself, less about effort and more about containment. As this containment strengthens, boundaries begin to shift again, not through strategy, but through state. The work moves from managing situations to allowing a different way of being to organize them. That shift from effortful navigation to natural containment is where we turn next. Section 8, from effort to natural containment. At a certain point in this work, something begins to change in a way that is difficult to describe, but unmistakable to feel. Boundaries stop feeling like tasks you must perform and start feeling like conditions you inhabit. There is less internal debate, less preparation, less tension before contact. Not because life has become easier, but because your system is no longer organizing itself around constant effort. This shift does not arrive dramatically. There is no moment of mastery, no clear line between before and after. Instead, there is a gradual redistribution of energy. What once required vigilance begins to require less attention. What once felt fragile begins to feel weighted, grounded, and self-supporting. This is the difference between control and containment. Control is effortful. It relies on monitoring, adjustment, and correction. It asks the system to stay alert, to anticipate, to intervene. Containment, by contrast, is passive in the deepest sense of the word. Not passive as in disengaged, but passive as in supported. It is the feeling of being held from the inside. When containment is present, boundaries no longer need to be asserted constantly because there is something solid behind them. They are not reactions to pressure. They are expressions of structure. Earlier, regulation required conscious attention. You noticed sensation. You slowed response. You stayed present when the impulse to override arose. This was necessary work, but it was also work. And like all work, it drew from finite resources. Natural containment emerges when regulation becomes less deliberate and more embodied. The system learns through repetition that it can remain intact without constant intervention. The muscles soften without collapsing. Attention remains anchored without effort. Emotional signals register without urgency. From this state, boundaries feel less like decisions and more like gravity. You do not have to decide not to lean forward when there is nothing pulling you. You do not have to say no when the system is no longer oriented toward automatic yes. This is why the contrast between resistance and solidity matters. Resistance pushes against something. It requires tension. Solidity simply occupies space. It does not need to oppose in order to exist. Many people mistake resistance for strength. They brace themselves, hold firm, grit their teeth internally. This can work temporarily, but it is exhausting, and it often triggers counter pressure, both internally and externally. Solidity is quieter. It does not argue with impulses. It outlasts them. It allows sensation, emotion, and relational pressure to move around it without requiring immediate response. From solidity, boundaries feel less personal. They are not statements about others. They are acknowledgments of your own limits. This is where emotional space becomes something you feel rather than enforce. Space is no longer created by pulling away or pushing back. It is created by staying where you are. You may notice this first in subtle ways. Conversations end more naturally. You feel less compelled to fill silence. Requests land without immediately activating internal calculation. You feel less pressure to justify your internal state. This does not mean you no longer care. In fact, care often becomes clearer. But it is no longer fused with urgency. You can feel concern without needing to act. You can feel empathy without losing center. At this stage, effort begins to look unnecessary in places where it once felt essential. You may find yourself surprised by your own responses. You pause without intending to. You decline without rehearsing. You disengage without explanation. These moments can feel unsettling at first. There may be a residual expectation that something bad should happen, that you should feel guilty, anxious, or corrective. When that reaction does not arrive, it can feel almost disorienting. This is the system recalibrating. Containment develops when the nervous system trusts that it can remain connected without dissolving. Trust builds through experience, not intention. Each time you stay present without overextending, the system learns that nothing catastrophic occurs. Each time you allow discomfort to pass without intervention, capacity increases. Importantly, containment is not rigidity. It does not mean you become immovable or closed. It means that movement happens from choice rather than pressure. You can still lean in when you want to. You can still give generously, but the giving is no longer compulsive. This is often where people notice a change in how others respond to them, not because they are trying to influence outcomes, but because their internal state has shifted. When containment is present, interactions reorganize around it. Others may sense clarity without explanation, or they may test limits more directly. Both are normal. What matters is that your internal experience is different. You feel less reactive, less compelled, less scattered. There is more room between stimulus and response, and that room does not need to be actively maintained. In this space, identity begins to loosen. You are no longer defined primarily by responsiveness or emotional labor. You are present without performing, available without disappearing. This can feel unfamiliar, especially if your sense of self was built around being needed. Containment allows you to experience yourself as a whole system rather than a set of functions. You are not here to manage the environment. You are here to inhabit yourself within it. This does not eliminate challenge. Difficult interactions still arise. Discomfort still appears. But the system no longer treats these moments as emergencies. They are experiences to be moved through rather than problems to be solved. One of the clearest signs of this shift is reduced internal commentary. Less explaining to yourself, less narrating, less evaluating. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer compensating for a lack of internal support. This quiet is not emptiness. It is coherence. From here, boundaries are no longer a primary focus. They are integrated into how you move, speak, and relate. You do not think about them as much because they are no longer fragile. And as they recede into the background, something else comes into focus. The question of who you are when you are no longer organized around overextension. What remains when effort gives way to presence? That question opens the next phase of this journey. Section 9, Loosening Identity. Who you are without overextension. As boundaries stabilize and containment becomes more familiar, a quieter and more existential layer begins to surface. It is not about behavior anymore. It is about identity, about who you are when you are no longer oriented around anticipation, emotional labor, and constant adjustment. And for many people, this question carries an unexpected weight. Over time, overextension often becomes more than a pattern. It becomes a self-definition, being the one who understands, the one who adapts, the one who notices what others miss. These traits may have been admired, relied upon, even praised. They provided coherence. They offered a sense of value and belonging. Letting go of overextension can therefore feel less like relief and more like loss. This is where a quiet fear often emerges. Not a dramatic fear, but a subtle one. The fear of becoming less good, less caring, less connected, less needed. When boundaries strengthen, there can be an uneasy sense that something essential is being withdrawn, even when nothing overtly negative is happening. This fear is rarely spoken, but it shapes resistance at an identity level. If you are no longer the one who anticipates, smooths, absorbs, or adjusts, who are you in relation to others? What anchors your sense of worth? What ensures connection? For many, identity was organized around responsiveness because responsiveness once guaranteed safety and belonging. It created a role that made sense in uncertain environments. That role may no longer be necessary, but the nervous system does not automatically know that. It still equates usefulness with security. This is why boundaries can feel like erasure rather than definition. Instead of experiencing them as clarifying, you may experience them as subtractive, as if something that made you recognizable, both to yourself and to others, is fading. But what is actually fading is not care or goodness. What is fading is compulsion. Compulsion feels like identity because it is constant. Choice, by contrast, feels unfamiliar because it introduces variability. When overextension was automatic, you did not have to decide who you were in each moment. The role decided for you. As that role loosens, there can be a temporary sense of emptiness or disorientation. This is not a void to fill. It is a space to inhabit. Identity at this stage begins to reorganize around self-definition rather than reaction. Boundaries are no longer experienced as defenses against others. They are expressions of what aligns and what does not. They say quietly, "This is me. This is where I am. This is what I can offer right now." This kind of identity is less performative. It does not require constant adjustment to remain intact. It is slower, heavier, and more grounded. It allows you to be present without scanning, to listen without preparing a response, to care without managing outcomes. Initially, this can feel unsettling. You may notice moments where you are not doing what you used to do, not reaching out, not checking in, not fixing. And in those moments, there may be a reflexive question. Am I still a good person? This question reveals how deeply morality and overextension were fused. Being good became synonymous with being available, being kind with being self-sacrificing, being connected with being emotionally porous. But goodness does not require depletion, and connection does not require disappearance. As identity loosens, goodness becomes less about effort and more about integrity, less about how much you give and more about whether what you give is real, less about maintaining harmony and more about remaining aligned. This shift can change how relationships feel. Some connections may become quieter, less intense, less emotionally charged. This can be misinterpreted as distance. In reality, it is often the absence of overfunctioning. The relationship is no longer being propped up by constant adjustment. Other relationships may deepen. When emotional labor is removed, what remains is more authentic contact. Conversations may be shorter but clearer. Presence may replace performance. There is also a shift in how you experience yourself when alone. Without the constant orientation toward others, you may notice unfamiliar internal space. At first, this space can feel empty or undefined. Over time, it begins to feel like room to notice your own rhythms, your own interests, your own limits, not as projects to improve, but as realities to respect. This is where boundaries fully transform in meaning. They are no longer primarily about saying no. They are about saying yes from a place of truth. Yes to rest, yes to interest, yes to engagement that does not cost you your center. Identity here becomes less rigid, not more. You are not replacing one role with another. You are allowing identity to be contextual and alive. Sometimes you give generously. Sometimes you do not. Sometimes you engage deeply. Sometimes you pull back. None of these require justification. This flexibility is not detachment. It is freedom from compulsion. There may still be moments of doubt. Old patterns do not disappear entirely. You may occasionally feel the urge to step back into the familiar role, especially under stress. But now that urge is recognized as an impulse, not an obligation, and recognition changes everything. You are no longer trying to be someone. You are allowing yourself to be someone. This someone is less predictable, but more real. Less defined by anticipation, more defined by presence. From this place, boundaries no longer feel like something you have to maintain. They feel like a natural extension of who you are becoming. They are not walls, they are contours. And as identity continues to loosen around effort and overextension, another question arises naturally. Not who you should be, but how to live from this place sustainably. How to integrate this way of being into daily life without turning it into another project. That integration is where we turn next. Section 10. A choice you can return to. There is often an expectation that work like this should end with resolution, with clarity that feels final, with a sense that something has been completed, integrated, and put away. But emotional boundaries do not resolve in that way. They do not arrive as a permanent achievement. They live as a relationship with yourself that continues to evolve over time. What changes gradually is not that you never overextend again. What changes is that overextension no longer defines you. It becomes something you notice rather than something you inhabit, a movement rather than an identity, a moment rather than a condition. This is where patience becomes essential. Not patience as endurance, but patience as permission. Permission to be in process without needing to arrive. Permission to move in and out of alignment without turning that movement into a verdict about who you are. Boundaries in this sense are not a line you draw once and defend forever. They are a capacity you return to, a felt sense of where you are in relation to yourself. Some days that sense is clear and stable. Other days it is quieter, harder to access, or temporarily overridden by stress, fatigue, or old relational patterns. This variability is not a failure. It is a feature of being human. The nervous system does not operate in straight lines. It cycles. It contracts and expands. It responds to context. Expecting yourself to remain permanently regulated, permanently differentiated, permanently contained, only recreates the very pressure this work was meant to release. Instead, what becomes available is choice. Not the choice to control every interaction, but the choice to notice. To notice when your attention begins to leave your body, when your breath shortens, when urgency creeps in, when responsibility expands beyond what feels true. Noticing does not require correction. It does not require immediate action. Often noticing is enough to interrupt the spiral of self-abandonment. It creates a moment of contact, and contact is where return becomes possible. Return is a gentle concept. It does not imply failure or deviation. It assumes movement. You move away, you come back, again and again. Each return strengthens familiarity. Each return builds trust. You may return by pausing, by softening your shoulders, by allowing yourself to feel what you were about to override, by choosing not to respond immediately, by letting something remain unfinished. These are not techniques to master. They are gestures of self-relationship. Over time, these gestures accumulate. They create continuity, a sense that even when you lose yourself briefly, you know how to come back. That knowledge is quiet but stabilizing. There is no urgency here, no requirement to change faster, no expectation to be different tomorrow than you are today. The nervous system does not respond well to deadlines. It responds to consistency and safety grows through repetition, not pressure. You may notice that the more you trust return, the less catastrophic misalignment feels. You stop fearing that one moment of overextension will undo everything. You stop interpreting discomfort as danger. You begin to experience boundaries as elastic rather than brittle. Elasticity is a sign of health. It allows movement without rupture. It allows connection without collapse. It allows you to engage fully and step back when needed, without framing either as a moral issue. This is where inner freedom quietly takes shape, not as independence from others, but as independence from compulsion. You are no longer driven by the need to anticipate, manage, or absorb in order to feel secure. You are free to respond rather than react. Freedom here does not mean ease at all times. It means agency within difficulty, the ability to stay present when things are unclear, the ability to tolerate not knowing, the ability to let others have their experience without making it your responsibility. From this place, care becomes cleaner. It is offered rather than extracted. It flows rather than strains. You give because you want to, not because you must. And when you do not give, you remain intact. This is not detachment, it is grounded connection. You may find that as you live from this orientation, Life becomes quieter internally, not empty, but less crowded. There is more room between thoughts, more space around emotion, less commentary about what should be happening. This spaciousness is not something you create. It emerges when effort relaxes, when the system no longer needs to be on guard, when identity loosens around overfunctioning, and when you do find yourself slipping back into old patterns, as you inevitably will. The invitation is simple: not to judge, not to fix, but to notice and return. Return to sensation, return to breath, return to weight, return to the simple fact of being here. Not as a task, but as a reminder. This is the choice you can always make. Not once, but many times. Not perfectly, but sincerely. There is nothing to complete, nothing to graduate from, no version of yourself you must become in order for this to be valid. The work is already happening in your awareness, in your capacity to notice, in your willingness to come back. From here, life continues, relationships continue, challenges arise, but you move through them differently, less fragmented, less pressured, more aligned with yourself. That alignment is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It feels like quiet permission, like standing on your own ground without needing to defend it. And that, in the end, is enough.